Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Khaleed. Welcome back to Journey Through the Colonial Archives, episode number 8. Over the first part of our journey, we have followed a paper trail across 6 centuries. Today, we pause. We pull back from the individual documents to look at the full map we have charted together. Let's recall what we have learned. Gomes Eanes de Zurara publishes the Chronicle of Guinea, the first European book about Africans in the modern era. Commissioned by a king, designed to justify systematic raiding on the West African coast, it introduces the foundational argument of anti-black racism, that Africans constitute a separate, lesser category of humanity, whose enslavement is an act of Christian mercy. The idea precedes the law. It always does. Pope Nicholas V issues Romanus Pontifex, granting Portugal the explicit legal and theological right to invade, capture, and reduce African people to perpetual slavery. Zurara's argument becomes papal law. The most powerful institution in the Western world wraps human predation in the language of the sacred. Pope Alexander VI divides the entire non-European world between Spain and Portugal along a line drawn on a map. The theological authorization becomes geographic. Queen Elizabeth I charters the East India Company, establishing the corporate template that will govern colonial extraction for the next 4 centuries. Private profit, sovereign authority, military force, legal immunity, the template that every subsequent colonial charter copies. The Virginia Company's Great Charter institutes the headright system, making the importation of human beings the fastest path to land ownership in the American colonies. The Virginia General Assembly passes partus sequitur ventrem, making slavery hereditary through the mother. A woman's children become assets generating both labor and land in perpetuity. King Charles II charters the Royal African Company, making the Crown an explicit corporate partner in the slave trade. The Iron Triangle locks into place. The Virginia Slave Code consolidates the legal architecture of racial chattel slavery, categorizing black slaves as persons for land grants, but as property for everything else. The paradox is written into law. 14 European nations gather in Berlin and divide the African continent among themselves without a single African present. The lines they draw are still the lines on the map. Looking at the chronological map, 2 things become clear. First, colonialism was not a series of separate historical events. It was a system. Each document built on the previous one. The papal bulls could not have been issued without Zurara's ideological foundation. The headright system could not have operated without the Virginia Company Charter. The Royal African Company could not have functioned without the headright system creating its market. The Berlin Conference could not have divided Africa without the doctrine of discovery, born in those same papal bulls, providing the legal framework. And in 1971, the Powell Memo could not have built its machine without the corporate template established by the East India Company Charter 4 centuries earlier. Second, the consequences of those documents are not historical. They are present. The racial wealth gap in the United States today is a direct consequence of the headright system, the hereditary slavery law, and the Virginia Slave Code. The political instability across the African continent today is a direct consequence of the borders drawn in Berlin in 1884. The corporate capture of American democratic institutions today is a direct consequence of the Powell Memo's 50-year execution. So, what does knowing all of this actually change? It changes the diagnosis. When we understand that the racial wealth gap is the predictable outcome of a legal system deliberately designed to produce it, the diagnosis changes. It changes the conversation. When we can point to the specific documents, the the specific dates, the specific language, the specific signatures. The conversation moves from opinion to evidence. It changes the objective. When we understand why and how the system was built, we understand that the goal is not to try and change a system that functions exactly as it was designed, but to design a new system. In our next episode, having traced colonialism from its ideological origins to its legal and institutional architecture, we now have a foundation from which to examine three of the most troubled and problematic documents ever drafted in history: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. You cannot change what you cannot see. I'm Professor Khaleed. Join me next time as we continue our journey through the colonial archives.